In today's video, we're talking about castles. The giant fortresses, so durable they withstood the sieges of enormous armies. But it wasn't just the cold stones that kept their walls standing. It was the calculated strategy, ingenious engineering, and the unwavering courage and unity of their defenders. Ever wonder how a pile of rocks kept entire armies at bay for months, sometimes years? Medieval castles weren't just oversized stone houses for nobles. They were sophisticated war machines, each one a puzzle designed to exhaust, terrify, and ultimately defeat anyone foolish enough to attack. Their power wasn't brute force. It was intelligence encoded in stone. But here's what most people miss. Castle defense wasn't about dramatic last stands or heroic sword fights. It was about preparation, psychology, and understanding one simple truth: time is the ultimate weapon. Tonight, we're going deep into how castles actually worked. Not the Hollywood version with endless battles and oil dumps every 5 minutes. The real thing. Smarter, stranger, and far more deadly than anything you've seen on screen. Hey, before we dive in, quick thing. If you like medieval videos, listening to culture of the past, their unbelievable inventions, peaceful life and combat tactics, hit like or subscribe. I always wonder where everyone's at. Comment your city and what time it is. Weird to think some of you might be having breakfast in Tokyo while I'm recording this at night. Anyway, get comfortable. Fix those pillows, grab that blanket. This one's worth settling in for. Imagine you're a medieval lord with enemies circling like wolves. You have resources, workers, and one critical decision to make: where do you build your castle? Get this wrong and all the stone walls in the world won't save you. Get it right and you've won half the battle before a single sword is drawn. Castle builders obsessed over location, like modern real estate developers, except instead of location, 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 it was defense, defense, defense. High ground was the prize. Hills, cliffs, rocky outcrops, anything that forced attackers to fight gravity before they even reached your walls. Edinburgh Castle in Scotland sits atop a volcanic plug, a natural fortress that exhausted armies just trying to climb up. The ultimate medieval workout plan: trudge up a steep hill in full armor while people throw rocks at your head. But height alone wasn't enough. Smart builders looked for water features. Rivers, lakes, marshland, natural barriers that siege equipment couldn't cross. Caerphilly Castle in Wales is surrounded by artificial lakes covering 30 acres. Attackers couldn't just march up with their battering rams and trebuchets. They had to figure out how to cross water while arrows rained down from above. Some castles were built on peninsulas, like Bodiam Castle with its massive moat. Only one approach path, which meant defenders knew exactly where enemies would come from. No surprises, no flanking maneuvers, just a single killing zone to focus all your defenses on. Weather became an ally too. Castle builders in northern regions knew winter winds would blast exposed siege camps, while defenders stayed warm inside. Spring rains turned dirt roads into mud pits. Nothing ruins a good siege like watching your expensive siege tower slowly sink into 6 inches of mud, its wheels grinding to a halt while your men push uselessly, becoming easy targets for archers. At Carrickfergus Castle in Wales, the steep limestone cliff gets so slippery when wet that it's nearly impossible to climb safely. Attackers who tried found themselves sliding backward, losing their footing, tumbling down the rock face. No defenders needed. Gravity did the work. The psychological impact of location can't be overstated. Imagine marching for days, your army exhausted and hungry, only to round a bend and see your target, a massive stone fortress perched impossibly high on a cliff, surrounded by water, approached by a single narrow path. Many attacking forces lost their nerve right there. Records show several sieges were abandoned simply because commanders looked at the castle's position and decided it wasn't worth the cost. Forests were carefully managed around castles, not cleared entirely. That would eliminate cover for your own forces, but strategically trimmed to restrict movement of siege weapons, while providing concealment for defenders to launch counterattacks. Some lords even engineered the landscape, creating artificial ponds, diverting streams, clearing specific sightlines. This is where castle defense really began, months or years before construction started, with men studying terrain, testing approaches, imagining every possible attack vector. The stone walls everyone thinks of as the castle? Those came second. The real first defense was geography itself, carefully chosen and sometimes artificially enhanced. Think about that next time you see a castle perched dramatically on a hilltop. That's not for aesthetics. That's calculated warfare, frozen in stone. Once attackers overcame the natural defenses, and many never did, they faced the castle's second layer, walls specifically engineered to absorb punishment and deal death. These weren't just big, they were engineering marvels that would impress modern architects. The thickness would shock you. Many castle walls measured 20 feet thick at the base, about the length of a school bus. Dover Castle's walls reached nearly 21 feet at their thickest point. Medieval contractors never worried about clients complaining. I said thick walls, not that thick. Because in medieval warfare, you could never have walls too thick. But here's the genius. It wasn't just solid stone all the way through. That would be impossibly expensive and actually less effective. Medieval engineers developed a sandwich construction, 2 parallel stone faces with rubble fill between them. Workers would build the outer and inner stone walls, then pour smaller stones, broken rubble, and mortar into the gap. This rubble core served multiple purposes. It absorbed energy from battering rams. The wall could flex slightly rather than crack. It was cheaper than solid stone, and it created a self-healing quality. If the outer face was damaged, the rubble behind would spill out and naturally fill gaps, preventing complete breaches. Mason Aldrich, a fictional but representative master builder, might have explained it like this. See, when a battering ram hits solid stone, all that force has nowhere to go but through. The stone cracks, but hit rubble fill? The wall flexes, absorbs the impact, like punching a pillow instead of a brick. Many walls featured a sloped base called a talus. This wasn't decorative. It deflected attacks upward instead of straight into the wall, making battering rams less effective. The slope also created a nightmare angle for siege ladders. Try standing a ladder against a sloped wall. It slides right off or sets at such an angle that climbers are practically lying on their backs, completely exposed to defenders above. Medieval architects discovered that slippery slope wasn't just a logical fallacy. It was a brilliant defense strategy. The most sophisticated castles featured concentric walls, an outer wall and a taller inner wall behind it. This meant even if attackers breached the first barrier, they found themselves trapped in a narrow space between walls, with defenders shooting from both sides. The killing ground. Caught between a rock and a hard place, literally. Some builders incorporated small pebbles into mortar near wall foundations. These loose materials would shift and make noise when disturbed by enemy sappers trying to tunnel underneath. Medieval alarm systems. No batteries required, just physics and gravel. The walls of Krak de Chevaliers in Syria, one of the best preserved Crusader castles, demonstrate this layered thinking perfectly. 2 concentric walls, massive towers, and a design so effective it withstood a dozen sieges over 160 years. But walls alone weren't enough. Attackers developed specialized weapons, battering rams, siege towers, trebuchets, which brings us to the next crucial element, the gate. If walls were the castle's shield, the gatehouse was its deadly puzzle. The weakest point in defenses, yet paradoxically often the strongest, because medieval engineers transformed what could have been a vulnerability into history's most ingenious death trap. Let me walk you through what an attacker faced approaching a typical 14th century gatehouse. First, the drawbridge over the moat. Heavy chains operated by counterweight systems inside the gatehouse could raise this in seconds, creating an impassable gap. But let's say attackers arrived while the bridge was down, during a supply delivery, or when gates were open for daily traffic. Second, massive wooden doors reinforced with iron bands, several inches thick. A battering ram could eventually break these, which is exactly what defenders expected. Because behind those doors waited the real trap, the portcullis, a heavy wooden or iron grate that could drop from above in under 2 seconds. Advanced gatehouses featured 2 portcullises spaced about 20 feet apart. Medieval architects invented the world's first crush zones, long before car manufacturers thought of them. Except these were designed to crush people, not absorb impact. Imagine you're in the attacking force. You've broken through the outer doors. You're rushing forward with adrenaline pumping, and suddenly, crash, an iron grate slams down behind you. Crash, another drops in front. You're trapped in a stone box 20 feet long, completely sealed. Then comes the rain. Above you, murder holes, openings in the ceiling through which defenders drop rocks, boiling water, burning pitch. Nothing says unwelcome guest quite like a hot sand shower from above. Sand was often preferred over oil. Oil was expensive. Sand got under armor, caused excruciating burns, and you couldn't shake it out. The walls on both sides. Arrow loops, narrow slits giving archers protected positions with wide fields of fire. Medieval arrow slits were the original "I can see you but you can't see me" technology. Defenders could shoot freely while remaining nearly impossible to hit back. The entire gatehouse typically projected outward from the main walls, creating a three-sided kill box. Defenders could rain destruction from above and both sides simultaneously. The gatehouse at Beaumaris Castle extends nearly 40 feet beyond the main walls, creating a gauntlet few attackers survived intact. Some designers added psychological elements, sharp turns that disoriented attackers and prevented battering rams from building momentum. False gates that looked like entrances but led to even more heavily defended areas. Medieval catfishing, when that attractive entrance turns out to be a deadly trap. Records from the Siege of Chateau Gaillard in 1204 describe attackers breaking through the outer defenses, only to be slaughtered in the gatehouse passage. The narrow space prevented them from using numbers as an advantage, while defenders above had perfect target practice. Castle builders thought of everything. The spiral staircases in gatehouse towers, they curved clockwise ascending. This gave defenders coming down the advantage. Their right arms sword arms free to swing, while attackers climbing up had their sword arms hindered by the central stone column. Even the staircases were designed to kill people. The gatehouse wasn't just a defensive feature. It was a statement. You can try to enter, but every inch forward will cost you blood. Archers, death from above. Height advantage defined medieval warfare. An archer on a 60-foot wall wasn't just higher up, he was untouchable, deadly, and psychologically devastating to enemies below. The top of castle walls featured crenellations, the iconic up-and-down pattern everyone recognizes. But these weren't decorative. The raised sections merlons protected defenders, while the gaps, embrasures, allowed them to shoot arrows or throw projectiles. Medieval social distancing. Stay behind the stone, shoot through the gaps, don't die. Behind the merlons ran the wall walk, a pathway where defenders moved quickly around the perimeter. These were carefully sized, wide enough for two armored men to pass without anyone awkwardly falling off to their death. From these elevated positions, defenders had overwhelming advantages. Longbowmen could fire arrows from 200 yards away with devastating accuracy. Elevation meant distance. An arrow shot from height traveled farther and hit harder. A rain of arrows wasn't just deadly, it broke morale. Imagine being in the attacking force. You hear nothing but the hiss of incoming shafts and the screams of men falling beside you. You can't see where the arrows come from. You can't shoot back effectively. You just have to march forward through the killing field, hoping you won't be next. That's not cinematic drama, that's psychological warfare at its finest. Crossbowmen handled closer targets. Their bolts could pierce armor at 100 yards. Some towers featured arrow loops arranged to create overlapping fields of fire, meaning attackers faced arrows from multiple directions simultaneously. Try dodging arrows from multiple directions while climbing a ladder carrying a sword and shield. It's the medieval version of a very unfair video game. Heavier weapons included springolds, large crossbow-like devices that hurled iron-tipped darts, powerful enough to skewer multiple attackers. Nothing brings enemies together quite like being pinned by the same giant dart. These mounted weapons could punch through shields and continue through the men behind them. But the simplest weapons were often most effective. Rocks. Heavy stones dropped from heights of 30 to 60 feet, crushed shields, helmets, and the people underneath. A 20-pound rock dropped from 40 feet hits with the force of a horse kick. Physics doesn't care about armor. Defenders also had specialized projectiles. Heated sand or boiling water. Contrary to popular belief, oil was too expensive for regular use, poured through machicolations, stone projections with floor gaps. Hot sand would get under armor, causing excruciating burns, while boiling water could scald attackers to death. Some castles got creative with biological warfare. Diseased animal carcasses were catapulted into enemy camps or thrown down on besieging forces, spreading plague and terror. When attackers did the same thing back, clever defenders sometimes catapulted the mess right back along with beehives and wasp nests. Talk about returning unwanted gifts with interest. Every strike from above wasn't just about killing. It was about forcing hesitation. When attackers stopped to shield themselves, they stalled. When they stalled, panic spread. When panic spread, the siege began to crumble. A castle didn't have to kill everyone outside its walls. It just had to remind them that every step forward meant another brutal surprise waiting above. Towers. The all-seeing eyes. Medieval castle towers weren't just impressive stone structures. They were sophisticated battle stations that controlled the entire defensive system, combining observation, weaponry, and psychology into soaring statements of power. Rising up to 100 feet tall, towers gave defenders the ultimate advantage. They could see enemies long before enemies could threaten them. First and foremost, towers served as early warning systems. Lookouts stationed at the top could spot approaching armies days before arrival, using smoke signals, fire beacons, or flag systems to alert the castle and nearby friendly forces. The Tour de Constance in France featured a special chamber for signal fires visible 20 miles away. Those medieval lookouts were like human traffic cameras, except instead of issuing speeding tickets, they handed out arrows. Tower design evolved significantly over centuries. Early square towers had a serious flaw: blind spots at corners where attackers could work unseen, using these protected angles to undermine foundations or position siege equipment. By the 12th century, round or D-shaped towers became standard, eliminating blind spots and making it nearly impossible for battering rams to find flat surfaces to strike effectively. Curved walls also deflected projectiles better than flat surfaces. Strategic placement was crucial. Towers were typically spaced 100 to 200 feet apart, the effective range of a longbow ensuring overlapping fields of fire. Attackers approaching any section of wall would face arrows from multiple towers simultaneously. No safe approach, no blind spots, nowhere to hide. Inside, towers were sophisticated weapons platforms. Multiple levels featured arrow loops, narrow slits, splayed inward to give archers wide visibility and firing angles while presenting tiny targets to enemies outside. A man 20 feet away couldn't tell if an archer was ready to fire or even present. Meanwhile, the archer could see everything, track movements, choose targets carefully. Some towers featured special positions called enfilade loops, positioned to fire along the length of the wall rather than outward. If attackers somehow reached the wall base with scaling ladders, they'd be shot not just from above but from the side, arrows coming from angles they couldn't defend against. Towers connected via the wall walks, allowing defenders to move quickly between positions, responding to threats, reinforcing weak points. Many featured spiral staircases, always curving clockwise ascending, giving defenders the advantage in close combat if enemies somehow breached the lower levels. The keep, or Great Tower, served as the castle's final refuge. If outer defenses fell, defenders retreated here for a last stand. Keeps featured their own wells, food storage, and defensive capabilities. Rochester Castle's keep withstood a brutal siege in 1215, holding out even after King John's forces mined under one corner and brought it down. The surviving 3/4 of the keep continued to protect defenders inside. Towers also served psychological purposes. Their sheer size intimidated enemies, announcing from miles away that this castle was serious about defense. A well-designed tower wasn't just functional, it was a threat made solid, a promise that attacking would cost far more than anyone wanted to pay. From these elevated positions, defenders could see, shoot, and survive, while attackers struggled in the mud below, exposed and vulnerable. The tower wasn't just a structure, it was a statement. We see you, we're ready, and you're going to lose. The moat. More than just water. Between attackers and those impressive walls typically lay another obstacle: the moat, creating a serious problem that forced invading armies to slow down, expose themselves, and often reconsider their entire plan. Just when you thought attacking a castle couldn't get worse, now you need swimming lessons. Most moats measured between 10 to 30 feet wide and 5 to 10 feet deep. While water-filled moats were common around castles near rivers or lakes, they weren't just about drowning enemies. They served multiple critical functions. First, they prevented tunneling. Sapping, digging under walls to collapse them was a favored siege tactic. But dig under a water-filled moat and you hit the water table. Your tunnel floods. Your miners drown. Your clever plan becomes a watery grave. Second, they forced attackers to build bridges or use boats while arrows rained down from above. Either option was dangerous and time-consuming, giving defenders more opportunities to kill you. Dry moats worked effectively too, and were often preferred because they required less maintenance. These deep trenches could contain sharpened stakes, metal spikes called caltrops, designed so one point always faced upward, or in warmer regions, even dangerous animals. Nothing says go away quite like a ditch full of snakes. Some castle builders took psychological warfare to new levels by filling moats with sewage and rotting garbage. The smell alone might make attackers reconsider their plans. And if you fell in, well, medieval medicine wasn't equipped to handle the infections you'd develop. Crossing these barriers required massive engineering efforts. Attackers would spend days or weeks filling sections of moat with dirt, timber, bundles of sticks, anything to create causeways. All while defenders above rained down arrows, rocks, and worse. Records from various sieges describe dozens or hundreds of men dying just trying to fill moats, never even reaching the walls they came to attack. Drawbridges added another clever defense layer. Operated by counterweight systems or chains hidden inside the gatehouse, they could be raised quickly to create an impassable gap. Some advanced castles featured multiple drawbridges in sequence, creating several obstacles to overcome. The moat at Beaumaris Castle in Wales was designed with particular cunning. It was tidal, connected to the sea. This meant it could be used to resupply the castle by boat even during siege, while attackers could never reliably predict water levels. Sometimes it was full and impassable. Sometimes it was mud. Either way, it was a nightmare to cross. Interestingly, archaeologists examining Bodiam Castle found its impressive-looking moat was actually quite shallow in many places, suggesting it was designed partly for show. Medieval lords understood that sometimes looking tough was half the battle. If enemies believed the moat was deep and dangerous, they'd prepare for that, wasting resources and time. The moat represented medieval defensive thinking at its finest. Multiple purposes served by a single feature. It prevented tunneling, slowed surface attacks, created psychological barriers, and forced enemies to expose themselves for extended periods while trying to cross. Simple, effective, deadly. The moat embodied everything that made castles so difficult to conquer. Siege survival. Living behind stone. Once the gate slammed shut and the drawbridge rose, a medieval castle transformed from a fortress into a self-contained community. The real challenge wasn't just keeping enemies out, it was keeping everyone inside alive, sometimes for months. The original lockdown had nothing to do with pandemics and everything to do with not getting murdered. Food storage formed the backbone of siege survival. Castle designers built massive underground storerooms called undercrofts, specifically to hold provisions for extended isolation. These cool, dry spaces preserved grain, beans, dried fruits, and other staples that could last through long sieges. Barrels of salted fish lined the walls, smoked meats hung from hooks, hard cheeses stacked in neat columns, the kind that actually improved with age rather than rotting. Most castles maintained food stores to last at least 3 to 6 months, with some prepared for a full year of isolation. Dover Castle had storage capacity for a garrison of 100 men to survive nearly a year. Medieval meal prep wasn't about pretty pictures for Instagram. It was about not starving while arrows flew overhead. But food was secondary to the most critical resource: water. No matter how thick your walls or plentiful your food, thirst would defeat you within days without clean water access. Castle builders solved this by digging deep wells directly into bedrock beneath the central courtyard or keep. Some of these wells reached astounding depths. The well at Kerak Castle in Jordan plunges 120 feet down through solid rock. Workers would spend months or years digging by hand, using picks and shovels, removing bucket after bucket of stone and dirt. The smartest castle designers built their wells before constructing anything else, ensuring workers had water during the years-long building process. Nothing ruins your day quite like spending 5 years building impenetrable walls, then realizing nobody thought about drinking water. Other castles collected rainwater in massive cisterns that could hold thousands of gallons. Elaborate systems of gutters, channels, and filters directed roof runoff into underground storage tanks. This backup water supply provided security even if wells were poisoned or somehow blocked by enemies. Daily life during siege took place in cramped, uncomfortable conditions. The castle population swelled far beyond normal capacity, as peasants from surrounding lands sought protection behind its walls. Space became precious. Great halls that normally hosted feasts transformed into communal sleeping areas. Privacy vanished. Noble families who typically enjoyed private chambers might share space with dozens of others. Children slept on pallets on the floor. Old people claimed corners for themselves. Everyone made do with far less space than they were accustomed to. Medieval castle Wi-Fi would have had serious bandwidth issues, except the only thing streaming was the occasional leak in the roof. Sanitation presented another major challenge. Castle designers built latrines, essentially toilets, that emptied through shafts in the outer walls. Simple but effective during normal times. During sieges, however, these became vulnerable points that enemies could potentially climb through or use to start fires. Alternative arrangements included chamber pots emptied into dedicated waste pits in the courtyard. Some larger castles featured sophisticated systems. Pembroke Castle in Wales had a massive latrine tower that could accommodate 20 people simultaneously. Medieval architects understood, no matter how fancy your castle, everybody poops. Health concerns mounted as sieges dragged on. Fresh vegetables quickly ran out, raising the risk of scurvy and other deficiency diseases. Doctors stored dried herbs and medicines, but their effectiveness was limited by medieval medical knowledge, which included ideas like balancing bodily humors and bleeding patients for everything. Castle inhabitants relied heavily on brewing beer and wine, not just for morale, but because fermentation made these drinks safer than potentially contaminated water. Beer keeping medieval defenders both hydrated and slightly more optimistic about being surrounded by enemies since 10,066. The psychological impact of siege life cannot be overstated. Boredom, fear, and claustrophobia affected everyone trapped inside. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months. The same faces, the same walls, the same tension with no release. To combat this, castle life continued with structure and routine. Guards maintained regular watches, rotating positions every few hours. Craftspeople continued essential work. Blacksmiths repaired weapons and armor. Carpenters fixed damage. Weavers produced cloth. Religious services provided comfort and time markers, dividing weeks into recognizable patterns. Games helped pass endless hours of waiting. Chess, dice, backgammon, nobles and commoners alike sought distraction. Children invented games with sticks and stones. Musicians played instruments. People told stories, gossiped, argued, made the best of impossible situations. Being trapped in a castle during siege was like the world's worst vacation. But this communal suffering created bonds. Defenders who survived sieges together often remained close afterward, sharing an experience outsiders couldn't understand. The castle became more than a structure. It was a shared ordeal that transformed strangers into something like family. The secret ways. The most important doors in medieval castles were often the ones nobody could see. Behind massive walls and towers lurked networks of hidden passageways, concealed doors, and secret tunnels that served as both emergency exits and strategic advantages. The original emergency exits didn't have those annoying alarms, but they did occasionally have snakes. Secret escape tunnels, known as posterns or sally ports, allowed defenders to slip out undetected during sieges. These narrow passages typically emerged far from the main castle in wooded areas or ravines where sentries were unlikely to spot movement. Dover Castle features a famous example: a 200-foot tunnel through solid chalk cliffs that wasn't rediscovered until 1794, centuries after it was sealed up and forgotten. Imagine the planning required. Years of digging through rock, creating ventilation, supporting the ceiling, all while keeping the project secret from potential spies. These weren't just emergency exits. They were medieval versions of ghosting an unwanted party guest, out the back door while no one's looking. Hidden routes enabled defensive raids. Small groups could sneak out at night to sabotage enemy siege equipment, poison water supplies, or attack sentries. Records from the 1216 Siege of Dover describe defenders using sally ports for nighttime attacks that destroyed enemy catapults and killed engineers, significantly delaying the siege. Most of these exits had multiple sharp turns to prevent enemies from rushing in if they discovered the passage. Some featured false passages, deliberately designed traps for infiltrators. These led to dead ends where enemies would be cornered, or to hidden pits with spikes at the bottom, or to flooded chambers where intruders would drown. Cawdor Castle in Scotland featured a fake escape tunnel that led to a collapsed section. Anyone exploring it would trigger a stone fall designed to crush or trap them. Inside castles, secret passages connected different buildings within the complex. During peaceful times, these provided convenient shortcuts, allowing lords to move between buildings without going outside in bad weather. During sieges, they allowed defenders to move reinforcements quickly, without crossing open areas where they might be targeted by enemy archers. Some passages were built inside walls themselves, narrow spaces between outer and inner stone faces where a thin person could navigate. Others ran under floors or above ceilings, accessible through hidden doors activated by pressing specific stones in sequence. The secrecy of these passages created vulnerability as well as strength. Several castles fell because of betrayal involving hidden entrances. In 1330, Nottingham Castle was penetrated through a forgotten tunnel from a nearby tavern. Attackers bribed someone who knew about it, gained entry, and captured King Edward III's mother and her lover. At Chateau Gaillard, attackers discovered an unguarded toilet shaft, a latrine chute, that allowed them to infiltrate the fortress and open gates from inside. The castle designer who forgot to put guards near the bathroom probably had a really bad performance review. The most sophisticated castles had multiple layers of secret architecture. False walls, concealed chambers where treasures or important documents could be hidden, passages that only lords and their most trusted advisors knew about. Some of this knowledge was passed down verbally, never written, lost when key people died without sharing secrets. Modern archaeologists still occasionally discover forgotten rooms and passages in well-studied castles, proving that medieval builders successfully kept some secrets for centuries. Fighting back. Medieval siege machines were impressive, but castle defenders weren't just sitting around waiting to be crushed. They developed countermeasures that turned attacking a castle into a deadly game of medieval chess. When attackers rolled up with battering rams, giant logs with metal caps designed to smash gates, defenders didn't just stand there taking hits. They dropped massive stones directly onto the rams from battlements above. We're talking boulders weighing hundreds of pounds that could splinter wood and crush soldiers underneath. The medieval equivalent of dropping a piano on someone's head, except nobody got a funny tune at the end. Fire was another favorite tool. When siege towers, those massive wooden structures on wheels, approached walls, archers would unleash volleys of flaming arrows. Defenders also used long hooks on ropes to grab towers and pull them off balance. Nothing ruins your day like climbing a 60-foot siege tower, only to feel it suddenly leaning sideways like a drunk trying to climb stairs. Some defenders poured water down walls to make them slippery, preventing siege towers from getting close enough for their platforms to drop onto battlements. Others used poles with hooks to push scaling ladders away before attackers could reach the top. Trebuchets presented a different challenge. These giant catapults could hurl 200-pound stones from a distance, so defenders couldn't shoot the crews with arrows. Instead, they reinforced walls where impacts were expected, adding timber frames behind damaged sections to absorb additional force. They also conducted nighttime raids to sabotage these machines. Small groups would sneak out through posterns, approach enemy siege equipment under cover of darkness, and set fires or smash crucial components before retreating. One particularly clever trick: counting seconds between launches to predict impact zones and evacuate those areas before stones hit. Imagine you're in the enemy camp, finally sitting down for a meal after a long day of failing to break through castle walls. Suddenly something crashes near your tent. You look over and see a rotting sheep carcass split open, swarming with flies. Before you can process this, another projectile hits, a beehive that breaks apart, releasing hundreds of angry bees into your camp. That's psychological warfare at its finest. Countermining was crucial when attackers tunneled under walls. Defenders dug their own tunnels to intercept enemy sappers, using sophisticated listening devices, wooden drums that amplified vibrations from digging to track enemy progress. When the two tunnels met, brutal hand-to-hand combat would ensue in cramped, dark spaces where neither side had an advantage. Some defenders flooded enemy tunnels with water from stored barrels, drowning miners below. Others released smoke or even attack dogs into passages. A few historical accounts mention using bees or wasps in tunnel warfare, sealed hives thrown into enemy tunnels, creating chaos in confined spaces where there's no escape from stinging insects. Many castles kept specialized anti-siege equipment ready. Wooden frames called hoardings could be quickly assembled to extend the range from which defenders could drop things. These temporary platforms projected out from walls, covering the base where enemies might work, allowing defenders to drop stones or pour boiling water directly onto attackers below. The genius of these countermeasures was their flexibility. Defenders adapted to whatever attackers tried, always staying one step ahead because they had home field advantage. They knew every corner of the castle, every defensive feature, every trick their structure could perform. Attackers had to improvise against unfamiliar defenses while exposed to constant harassment. Defenders refined their techniques over weeks or months, learning from experience, perfecting their timing. This is why castle sieges so often failed. Defenders weren't passive victims waiting for walls to break. They were active, aggressive, constantly fighting back with every tool and trick at their disposal. The waiting game. Success in medieval warfare often came down to who could last the longest. Castles turned time itself into a weapon against attackers, and this might have been their most powerful defense of all. Psychological warfare was a key strategy. Defenders would feast on battlements at sunset, making sure the smell of roasting meat drifted toward hungry besiegers camped below. Musicians played cheerful songs. Laughter echoed from walls. Windows glowed with candlelight and firelight, suggesting warmth and comfort. Medieval trash talk didn't need words, just a chicken leg waved tauntingly from a tower window. The contrast was deliberate and devastating. Attackers sat in mud, eating moldy bread and spoiled meat, watching enemies celebrate above impregnable walls. This wasn't just about showing off. It was calculated to break morale. Every night that contrast grew more obvious, more unbearable. Sieges bankrupted attackers. A typical army in the 1300s cost about 500 gold pieces daily to maintain wages for soldiers, food for men and horses, replacement equipment, payment for skilled engineers and their siege machines. After weeks of going nowhere, achieving nothing, many lords simply ran out of money. Their armies would dissolve as unpaid soldiers deserted or demanded to go home. The siege of Kenilworth Castle in 1266 lasted 6 months before attackers gave up, having accomplished nothing except draining their treasury and losing hundreds of men to disease and occasional defensive sallies. Weather favored defenders. Winter sieges were brutal for armies camping outside. Tents provided little protection against snow, wind, and freezing rain. More soldiers died from cold, disease, and hunger than from fighting. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, sometimes entire limbs. Men huddled around inadequate fires, burning through firewood supplies, constantly wet and miserable. Castle residents weren't staying at a 5-star resort, but compared to attackers sleeping in mud, they might as well have been. Disease ravaged siege camps with terrifying efficiency. Hundreds or thousands of men living in close quarters, with poor sanitation, contaminated water sources, and inadequate nutrition created perfect conditions for epidemics. Dysentery, typhus, plague. These killed more besiegers than defenders' arrows ever did. Records from the Siege of Acre in 1191 describe more crusaders dying from disease than combat. Thousands weakened by illness, unable to fight, becoming burdens on their armies rather than assets. Castle defenders mastered surprise attacks called sorties. These weren't desperate last stands, but calculated strikes. Small groups of well-rested, well-fed defenders would rush out from hidden gates to target siege equipment or supply lines, before quickly retreating behind walls. The psychological impact was enormous. Besiegers could never truly rest, never feel safe even in their own camps. Deception helped too. Helmets placed on poles along walls made it seem like more soldiers guarded the defenses. Trumpets and drums played at random intervals, creating the impression of reinforcements arriving or mysterious activities happening inside. Enemy scouts would report these sounds, and commanders would worry about what they meant. Some defenders deliberately let small groups of attackers succeed in minor assaults, only to slaughter them once they were isolated inside the castle. Survivors who escaped would spread terrifying stories, making other soldiers reluctant to volunteer for future attacks. The most effective defense was often simple patience. About 60% of castle sieges ended with attackers simply giving up and going home. Not because walls were breached or defenders defeated, but because besiegers ran out of money, time, patience, or men willing to die for someone else's ambition. Think about that ratio. More than half of all sieges failed not through combat but through attrition. Time defeated armies more effectively than arrows, stones, or boiling water ever could. A castle didn't need to kill every attacker. It just needed to outlast their willingness to stay. And with deep wells, months of food supplies, and stone walls that had stood for generations, defenders had every advantage in the waiting game. When walls fall. Not every castle stood forever. Despite sophisticated defenses, some fortresses did fall, and understanding how reveals just how difficult conquest truly was. Mining. Tunneling under walls to collapse them was among the most effective siege tactics when properly executed. Attackers would dig tunnels under foundation corners, propping up the tunnel ceiling with wooden beams as they worked. Once the tunnel reached sufficient depth under the wall, they'd pack the space with combustible materials and set it ablaze. The beams would burn, the tunnel would collapse, and if everything went according to plan, the wall section above would fall. The Siege of Rochester Castle in 1215 featured one of history's most famous mining operations. King John's forces dug under the southeast tower, then used fat from 40 pigs to fuel an intense fire that burned the wooden supports. The corner tower collapsed, but incredibly, defenders retreated to the remaining three-quarters of the keep and continued fighting for weeks until starvation forced surrender. Betrayal caused more castles to fall than military might. A disgruntled guard opening a postern gate at night. A servant accepting bribes to leave a door unlocked. A lord's relative plotting to seize power. Internal treachery bypassed all the sophisticated defenses engineers had designed. At Chateau Guillard in 1204, attackers discovered an unguarded latrine chute and climbed up through the toilet system. Not glamorous, but effective. Once inside, they opened gates for their forces. The castle that had seemed impregnable fell because someone forgot to guard the bathroom. Starvation eventually defeated even the strongest defenses. No matter how well stocked the storerooms, supplies were finite. When food ran out, defenders faced impossible choices: surrender, attempt a desperate breakout, or slowly die inside stone walls that had protected them for months. The siege of Château de Montségur in 1244 lasted 10 months. When defenders finally surrendered, they were starving, having eaten their horses, leather goods, and anything else remotely digestible. The castle's defenses remained intact. Hunger defeated them where weapons could not. Some sieges ended through negotiation rather than conquest. Attackers would offer terms: surrender now and leave with your lives and possessions, or fight to the bitter end and face execution. Many defenders, recognizing their situation was hopeless, accepted such terms. Honor was preserved, lives were spared, and attackers avoided further casualties and expense. New weapons eventually made traditional castles obsolete. Gunpowder artillery, particularly cannon developed in the 14th and 15th centuries, could breach walls that had withstood battering rams and trebuchets for generations. Stone walls that flexed and absorbed impacts from mechanical weapons shattered under sustained cannon bombardment. The Siege of Constantinople in 1453 demonstrated cannon's devastating power. Ottoman forces used massive bronze cannon to breach walls that had protected the city for over 1,000 years. The medieval castle's dominance was ending, though the transition took centuries as artillery improved and castles adapted by building lower, thicker walls with angled faces to deflect cannonballs. But here's the important point. Even when castles fell, they typically did so only after weeks or months of siege, costing attackers enormous resources in time, money, and lives. A castle that delayed an army for 3 months while waiting for relief forces or exhausting enemy supplies had succeeded in its purpose, even if it eventually surrendered. The measure of a castle's success wasn't whether it never fell, but how long it stood, and what it protected during that time. Many castles that fell after heroic defenses saved countless lives by giving civilians time to flee, allowing friendly armies to mobilize, or simply exhausting enemy forces so thoroughly that further conquest became impossible. The human element. All the sophisticated engineering, all the clever defensive features, all the thick walls meant nothing without one crucial element: people willing to defend them. Castle defense was never just about knights in shining armor. It was a community effort where every person inside those walls, from seasoned soldiers to blacksmiths and cooks, had vital roles to play. Knights did matter. They were elite shock troops, the best trained and best equipped fighters. But in a siege, their job wasn't gallant dueling like in movies. It was plugging breaches, leading sorties, and most importantly, keeping morale alive when situations seemed hopeless. A knight who remained calm under pressure, who spoke confidently about relief forces coming or attackers running out of supplies, was worth his weight in gold for psychological effect alone. Archers were the real backbone of defense. From behind arrow slits and atop towers, they controlled the battlefield, cutting down siege crews, pinning enemies in place, and forcing attackers to crawl forward under shields. A skilled archer could shoot 10-12 arrows per minute, and a castle might have dozens of archers on duty. The volume of fire they generated made direct assaults suicidal. But the unsung heroes were ordinary townspeople. Women carried stones to battlements for defenders to drop. Children fetched water for boiling, or for dousing fires when flaming projectiles hit wooden structures. Blacksmiths worked day and night repairing weapons and armor, forging new arrowheads, maintaining the countless metal components that kept defenses functional. Carpenters built siege shields to protect defenders, repaired damage from impacts, and constructed wooden hoardings. Cooks managed precious food supplies, stretching provisions to last as long as possible while keeping defenders fed enough to fight. Even priests had crucial roles, blessing defenders, ringing bells to mark time and raise alarms, and keeping spirits from breaking during endless waiting. There were moments of desperate heroism. When walls were breached, defenders would rush to plug gaps with their bodies, fighting with spears, pikes, even farm tools. Close combat in narrow corridors favored the home team. Attackers couldn't spread out or use numerical superiority. They were forced into choke points where every defender counted double of them. Records describe women pouring boiling water from murder holes, children running messages between towers, elderly men too old to fight standing watch to free younger guards for combat positions. Everyone contributed because everyone understood. Losing the castle didn't mean retreat. It meant massacre, slavery, or worse. This shared danger created intense bonds. Class distinctions didn't disappear entirely, but they softened. A noble who fought beside a peasant, both faces streaked with soot, both exhausted from days of battle, that experience created respect that peacetime never would. The psychological strength of defenders came from fighting for home. Attackers might be well-paid mercenaries, or conscripted peasants from distant lands. But defenders were protecting their families, their possessions, their very lives. That motivation made them fight harder, endure longer, and take risks that professional soldiers might avoid. Leadership made enormous difference. A lord who shared dangers with his men, who appeared on walls during attacks, who ensured fair distribution of food and duties, that lord inspired loyalty that no amount of money could buy. Conversely, a cowardly lord who hid in the keep while others died defending his castle might find himself betrayed by guards who decided they'd rather survive under new management. The most successful defenses combined engineering excellence with human courage, strategic thinking with tactical flexibility, and individual heroism with communal cooperation. Stone walls provided the framework, but people made it work. Legacy in stone. As you lie in your warm bed tonight, so different from the hard pallets medieval defenders slept on, think about what castles really represented. They weren't just military installations or noble homes. They were statements in stone about human ingenuity, determination, and the universal desire to protect what matters most. Every castle that still stands today, whether ruined or restored, is a testament to minds that thought in terms of centuries, not quarters. Builders who would never see their work completed. Engineers who refined defensive features across generations. Defenders who held walls knowing history would likely forget their names. The principles encoded in castle architecture remain relevant. Layered defense, multiple fallback positions, turning geography into advantage, using psychology as a weapon, making every resource count. These aren't just medieval military tactics, they're timeless strategies applicable far beyond warfare. Modern security systems, from network firewalls to airport screening, use concentric defense models directly descended from castle thinking. The idea that you don't rely on a single barrier but create multiple layers, each forcing attackers to expose themselves or expend resources, comes straight from medieval engineers. The psychological warfare that made sieges so difficult, maintaining morale while breaking enemy determination, applies to any competitive situation. Sports teams defending home turf, businesses protecting market share, communities preserving traditions against outside pressure. The fundamental dynamic remains. Those defending on familiar ground, fighting for what's theirs, have advantages that numbers and resources don't easily overcome. When you visit a castle, whether it's a famous fortress like Edinburgh or a lesser-known ruin slowly returning to the landscape, you're walking through frozen strategy. Every arrow slit, every murder hole, every curve of wall represents someone's solution to a deadly problem. Touch those stones and you're connecting with minds that lived 600, 700, 800 years ago, yet thought in ways we still recognize. They understood that survival often requires patience more than glory. That preparation prevents disaster. That communities working together can achieve what individuals cannot. That geography and engineering, properly combined, can overcome numerical superiority. These weren't romantic notions for them. They were life and death realities, and they built accordingly. The castle as a building type may have become obsolete with gunpowder and modern warfare, but the castle as an idea, as a philosophy of defense and survival, never dies. We still castle ourselves in various ways. We create barriers. We prepare for worst-case scenarios. We build support networks that can sustain us through difficult times. Medieval castles were the physical manifestation of human refusal to give up, to surrender, to accept defeat. They announced to the world, "This ground is ours. These people are protected. Come if you dare, but know that every step toward us will cost you dearly." That defiant spirit, encoded in millions of tons of carefully placed stone, outlasted the armies that attacked them, outlasted the lords who built them, outlasted the medieval world itself. So, that's the truth about castle defense. No Hollywood drama, no unrealistic last stands. Just patient, intelligent, brutal preparation combined with human courage and communal determination. Castles worked because they were designed by people who understood that the best defense isn't the strongest shield. It's the one that makes attackers question whether the fight is worth the cost. They worked because every feature from location to murder holes was optimized for one purpose: making sure that you, the defender, could survive while your enemy slowly bled resources, morale, and will to fight. They worked because time was on your side: food in the storerooms, water in the wells, stone walls that had stood for generations and would stand for generations more. While enemies camped in mud, facing disease, desertion, and dwindling supplies, you waited in relative comfort behind defenses that had been refined across centuries. The medieval world was brutal, violent, and short on romance despite modern fantasies. But it produced minds that thought strategically, built magnificently, and created structures so effective that many stand today, 600 years later, still impressive, still teaching us about defense, preparation, and the human spirit that refuses to yield. Next time you see a castle, don't just take a photo and move on. Stop, look at it properly. See the intelligence in its design. Imagine the lives lived behind those walls. Think about the armies that came and failed, that went home defeated, not by superior force, but by superior preparation and patience. Because that's what castles really were, not monuments to power, but monuments to survival. Reminders that smart defense, thorough preparation, and determination to outlast your enemies can overcome almost any threat. Sleep well tonight, secure in your modern comforts. But remember, the principles that kept medieval defenders alive behind stone walls: preparation, patience, community, and strategic thinking. Those remain just as relevant today as they were 700 years ago. The stone remembers. Even when the people are forgotten, the lessons remain, frozen in walls that refuse to fall. And maybe that's the real legacy of medieval castles. Not their military success, but their testament to human ingenuity and refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds. Stone upon stone, wisdom upon wisdom, the castle endures.